One area where public relations and advertising is very different is that when you pay for an ad, that's what appears. The challenge in PR is to try and influence an editorial community which is seeking legitimate news value, which is cynical and skeptical very often of approaches from companies and their agencies, and that's their job. So you have to try and work through that filter and deliver a message which includes the key components that the client is trying to convey, and is also, and then that takeaway is one that's positive about the client.
While most public relations campaigns are carefully planned and executed in a fairly routine manner, it is when a crisis occurs that public relations truly becomes critical.
There are obviously high-profile examples of crises that companies face that can make or break them, and some that people are familiar with, like the Tylenol product tampering scare, or when Perrier found benzene in its springs and in its products, and those companies face some very difficult challenges and were able to overcome them.
Oftentimes the first time that a client will get public relations counseling is when something bad happens to them. They are going along, everything's fine, and they feel they don't need PR. But then suddenly some crisis comes up and they need help responding.
Brown & Williamson is very pleased with the decision today by the federal court in North Carolina. We won today on the major commercial issue, which was our right to freely advertise and promote our products to adult consumers.
A crisis situation is one that often comes up for companies and for which they're not prepared. And one of the distinct disciplines of a public relations consultancy such as ours is a crisis communications capability. And the only way to effectively plan and manage for those types of events, because you never know when they're coming, is to really do a lot of preparation for them.
If you look at the classic academically identified exercise in the way not to handle a crisis, everyone points to the Exxon Valdez wreck off the coast of Alaska. And what happened there is this problem was out there. It was simmering. It was being handled at a low level of the corporation. And it wasn't until some week or 10 days after the fact, when there had been 10 days of coverage of birds and sea mammals covered in oil, dying and dead on the beaches, with people cutting up their Exxon credit cards on television and refusing to go to Exxon gas stations, that the corporate levels of Exxon finally recognized they had a need to mobilize public relations.
How do you turn that negative situation into an opportunity? I think you find ways that you can reach out to the public and say, first of all, we are sorry, we're acting as swiftly as we can to rectify the situation, and then we move on. We move on to rectifying it and then finding ways that we can improve our relationship.
The best situation is where you're proactively going after media coverage for your client. Very often you're reacting to a negative development or a crisis, and whether it pertains specifically to your client or to the industry as a whole, one of the takeaways on results is the balance between the positive and negative coverage that the client got. And the reality is what we really seek for them is accurate coverage.
Public service announcements are one way that some organizations have found to broaden their public relations effectiveness. Generally, PSAs help get the word out on behalf of public service, not-for-profit, healthcare, or safety causes.
Buckle up, buckle up, buckle up. One thing to say, and we know we're not wrong. When you go for a ride, put your safety belt on.
Public service announcements are a part of public relations, and it doesn't really matter what the cause is.
You chose to ignore the flashing signal. This is the next 60 seconds of your life.
The public service announcements that are on now have to do with underage drinking, have to do with underage violence, have to do with safe sex. In previous decades, public service announcements had to do with prenatal nutrition, had to do with fundraising for diseases, recognizing your symptoms of certain diseases, the kinds of things that generally don't have a lot of money behind them, but which are critically important to get out. And as a public service, broadcast entities, as part of their licensing process, agree to air a certain number of those in the course of a program cycle.
Ads such as these produced by the Ad Council, a not-for-profit organization sponsored by the advertising industry, help increase public awareness of critical issues that affect their lives. as well as build goodwill toward advertising in general.
Dan, it says each year 60,000 men and women die of colon cancer. But it's 90% curable if treated early. Maybe we should get a checkup.
Honey, I have more important things to worry about right now.
Whether the objective is damage control or building goodwill, public relations seeks to unobtrusively capitalize on mass media's ability to influence attitudes and change public behaviors.
What we really do now is not just deliver media coverage or ink or broadcast footage pertaining to a product launch or pertaining to the success of a mature product and moving it off the shelves. It's really helping companies or other institutions manage their reputation and communicate as effectively as they can to an ever wider range of publics who are becoming ever more sophisticated.
I see public relations as the lens that provides the corrective perspective in two directions. We correct the perspective of the organization as it looks out into the world, and we help it understand what the world wants and needs. And we correct the world's perspective on the corporation, and we help it understand what is good and positive and promoting about the corporation out into the world. So we're really advocates in two directions.
The ideal of public relations is symmetrical and will be symmetrical. And it's based on the concept, the communication concept of feedback. I want to know what you think. Not to be able to dupe you with what I know that you think, but using what you think to help me adjust and say, okay, you've got a point, let's do it this way. Together, we can make it work.
Essentially, as the medium has changed, public relations has evolved to allow those who need to be better understood and want to get their message out to be better understood and get their message out. In classical Greece, it was an oral society. The public relations function was essentially oral. In revolutionary America, where there were newspapers and leaflets and pamphlets, the public relations function congregated around there. In the early part of this century, public relations became very active in the newspapers and wire services, radio and television, and now, of course, everybody's talking about the internet. Every company wants to have a homepage. Every company wants to be able instantly to hook up satellite conferences with their employees in the field. So public relations is evolving to capitalize on new technology, but that's nothing new. That's been the case since the 5th century BC.